Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. What's really happening to China's AI ecosystem after the DeepSeek moment? Beyond the headlines, what do the leading Chinese AI labs actually look and feel like on the inside? Today, my guest is Kevin Xu, founder of Interconnected Capital and the author of the Interconnected newsletter, who has just returned from a fact-finding trip across China. He argues that even under harsh U.S. export controls and severe computing constraints, research remains the lifeblood of China's AI push. We walk through China's AI stack using Jensen Huang's 5-layer framework: applications, models, infrastructure, chips, and energy, asking why so many of the world's biggest open-weight models now come from Chinese labs, how a generation of young, homegrown researchers is reshaping the field, and how rising pressure for profitability is nudging some players away from openness, similar to their peers in the US. We also dig into the cultural side, how Chinese society is processing AI-driven job anxiety, and why the answer in many sectors is to double down on adoption rather than pull back. Finally, we zoom out to the global picture, how U.S. breakthroughs are ricocheting through China's ecosystem, whether the two countries are in a pure race or a messy form of coopetition, a term coined by Kevin, and what the new U.S.-China AI guardrails dialogue might actually achieve. Let's hear Kevin's perspective. Welcome back, Kevin. It was wonderful to have you as we started this show about a year ago. You were our second guest, and now we're having you back because you really are one of the I respect the most in terms of experts thinking about AI between US and China. So you were just in China a couple weeks ago. Tell us what you saw, what you learned.
Yeah. So first of all, great to be back on the show, Wenchi. Really appreciate you doing this for your audience. So I was in China between the latter end of April to the beginning of May. So I was on the ground for about 9 days to visit pretty much all the leading AI labs that are in China with a group of other newsletter writers and AI researchers as well. So it was a group of about, I think 10 of us, 10, 11 of us.
Was it organized by anyone or any
It was
organization?
organized by kind of ourselves. So we have this AI Substack writer bundle, if you will, called SAIL. SAIL is our acronym. So readsail.com is our bundle. And
We'll definitely subscribe to it.
Yeah, so it's a collection, right, of my writing, other people's writing, and through our collective writing, we actually got to know a lot of the researchers just on Twitter from leading AI labs in China, and we decided to actually make a trip there to meet them, to talk to them, to interact with them, to hang out with them for 9 days. So we traversed through Beijing, Hangzhou, Shanghai, and then Shenzhen, so a 4-city trip, and pretty much visited as many labs as they would have us. And this was during the May 1st holiday, right, which is a pretty big holiday in China. But a lot of them still are either working because they're working really hard.
We never stop.
Exactly, it's a race to AGI or whatnot, or they were accommodating to us visitors to really engage with us. So we really appreciate everybody who showed their generosity and time and hospitality to us. And we cover pretty much, I would say, 85% of all the leading labs that are being built in China right now. So Kimi, Minimax, Z.AI, Alibaba, Xiaomi's a new AI lab, which is super fascinating. Antling, which is the Ant Group AI lab, and a few others. And of course, we also visited Unitree. You can never go to China and not see a few robots, right? And we interacted almost exclusively with researchers if we can, right? So these are people who are not just on the ground, but also people doing the everyday work to improve the algorithm, improve the efficiency, reading the papers, running the experiments, as opposed to your VP of blah, 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 who might give you some corporate speak.
Last time when we spoke, it was just after the DeepSeek moment. From then until now, the world of AI has progressed so much. Where is China right now?
One of the biggest story that emerged from last year after the DeepSeek moment was China has this huge cohort of labs that are all embracing open weight models first. That openness and the way that open source tend to diffuse globally very quickly became one of the biggest stories from last year, which is that all the leading open models in the world are all coming from Chinese labs. While the US labs have continued to regress on that dimension, we become more and more close as time goes on.
And some people say that's really their advantage, right? That they're able to be used by like almost everyone else in the world.
That's right. They're not able to be just used, but also customized, right? And to be tuned in a way that's much more affordable and also much more flexible. Because frankly, a lot of large enterprises and companies need that flexibility to be able to tune models to their own workloads, their own data, their own environment in ways that are actually much harder to do for a closed model, even if that model is, from a benchmark perspective, smarter or more intelligent, or it will cost them a lot more because they have to probably have this very expensive commercial engagement with OpenAI or Anthropic to be able to do that. While for these open labs or open models, you can probably do it yourself, or you ask them on Twitter for help and they will probably help you for free. And then you kind of get that done. So that was the big context going into this trip. One thing that I gathered is that, first of all, DeepSeek still holds a very important role in the whole Chinese ecosystem in the sense that it put everybody else on the map and also gave everybody else a shot in the butt, if you will.
What do you mean put everyone else on the map? Because it became so well known?
Yeah, I would say before DeepSeek, the moment, no one really paid that much attention to whatever is happening in the AI ecosystem in China, except for people like us who track this stuff either for a living or for fun or for curiosity, right? And as soon as DeepSeek happened the way it happened, including DeepSeek itself, who did not expect that much attention, the whole world started paying attention. And then a lot of these labs actually also realized that open sourcing their model was a good strategy to get more exposure globally in ways that did not appreciate. One very clean example is that Moonshot AI, which makes the Kimi series model, their very first version, Kimi 1, was a closed source model. None of us heard about Kimi 1. It was completely irrelevant. And then after DeepSeek, Moonshot realized that we should probably be more open with our model to get more attention, more feedback from the developer community, also more adoption. So now all the Kimi models have been open source ever since, and they obviously have gotten a lot of traction and attention globally, not just in China.
I like to use Jensen Huang's framework to think about the AI whole ecosystem. So he would talk about the models, the infrastructure, and then energy, obviously applications. If we're really talking about the whole development of AI, you can't really miss any one of the 5 layers. So where do we want to start?
I would actually want to start with the models first because the focus of our trip is to talk to all the model makers. The model layer right now actually holds the key to evolving both the application on top of the model, but actually also the hardware below the model that I think is much less appreciated. And we're just seeing inklings of that with DeepSeek possibly raising a big funding round for the first time. A lot of the investors are actually from the hardware layer. DeepSeek is working very closely with the domestic GPU makers like Huawei or others to improve their hardware. And I think there's this very important relationship between the model makers, who are software by default or by definition, and the hardware makers. They actually have to work together to make each other better. These are not segregated two different worlds. We saw a lot of that from other labs that we interacted with in China. Some are still much more attached to the NVIDIA stack by their heritage or just what they know. Others are gravitating towards the domestic GPU providers to make sure they are having a good source of hardware for the future because of export control and how uncertain that is. So they're working closer with Huawei to co-design each other.
And what's most interesting in terms of the models?
One is, this is more of a cultural point, but it really struck me. Everybody we met on the researcher side are super, super, super young. They're all in their mid-20s. I will bet the average age of the leading Chinese lab researchers are significantly younger than the American counterparts.
Really? Why is that?
One, a lot of them are current PhD students. So they hold a very fancy title of intern, but they do real work. They're actually at these labs for a year, maybe even 2 years. They still hold their PhD status at their university, but they effectively are just employees of these labs. And their advisors are very happy that they're doing this for two reasons. One is because none of the universities in China or universities in general really have access to that much compute because compute is very, very expensive. So even if you have the best ideas in terms of research, you don't even have the resources to run it, to prove it, whether it's right or wrong. But the labs do. And the labs have a very symbiotic relationship with the institutions from the universities that we want your best students to work with us. You can definitely join published papers if we develop something interesting that you can also write about for your PhD dissertation or for your advisor. And then we are going to, of course, incorporate the finding into our next model.
Isn't that similar to what, at least in the past in Silicon Valley, the companies are the ones who work with universities because they have way more resources and much more in tune with what's happening? Is China different?
I don't think that part's very different, but the second part of this answer is that why are they so young, right? It's actually better that we hire younger, smarter people who do really good research but have no previous baggage in the academic field. Because the world of large language model or generative AI is still relatively new in the field, that you being a much more, say, experienced professor will have 10, 15 years in a big company doing AI stuff is actually a burden to your creativity.
And that is not the same in the US. That's what you're saying.
I'm sure there's still some premium to young, smart students getting good opportunity in these labs. I think the one big difference is that the Chinese interns that we talk to have real responsibilities. These are just employees. They have access to all the data, the system, the resources to experiment, try, do whatever.
So, how is that culture played into their actual model development?
Everybody told us, most certainly, we are very compute constrained. They're still allocating a lot of their compute for research purposes. For these young PhD interns to still experiment with new ideas, even though these ideas may not be some earth-shattering idea, you would think that with so little compute, maybe you're going to prioritize just inferencing to make money from customers.
I
Because
see.
that's
So,
always the
research
trade-off.
is still very, very important.
They prioritize research because that is kind of the lifeblood of how you need to move forward and advance as an AI model lab.
Would you say that's a different priority in the US?
The US labs are very much prioritizing research, but they also have a lot more to allocate. It's night and day compared to their counterparts in China.
So they're working with extreme constraints, but somehow they're able to still think that research is important because they recognize that developing or advancing models is important in terms of the future, right?
That's right. And my focus more on, say, cost efficiency or to reduce inference costs for a limited set of compute, as opposed to maybe dreaming up the next huge architectural change that's going to blow everybody out of the water, because that might require a lot more compute to even prove out your idea, right? Like every time you have an idea, that's a compute cost that you have to ask someone to allocate for you that could be making money for your customer, right? So that's always the trade-off inside any lab.
I find fascinating that how the modelers are working with chip designers and manufacturers. Tell us more about that.
A lot of folks obsess over whether a Huawei chip, whether it's the Ascend, the 960, 950, is on paper better or worse than the H200, H100. That's largely missing the point as far as how usable these chips actually are going to be in the real world. If you don't have a very strong software layer that can be built and customized by the actual software application or model makers, which are from these labs, then your hardware is actually fairly useless. because none of us can actually just like touch the hardware and make it do stuff. We have to code to make it do stuff, right? And the Huawei ecosystem called CAN, CANN, which is sort of the CUDA competitor to NVIDIA's world, is still very much behind as a software layer. But they're catching up very quickly is what I observe on the ground. And the reason why they're catching up very quickly is because they are working hand in hand with the labs who are telling them, hey, we released a really good model, probably trained on NVIDIA, most likely. Now, if you want our model to run really well on Huawei's Ascend chips, these are the 18 different optimizations and libraries and microkernels that you have to.
That actually reminds me of a conversation I had with a former R&D of Taiwan's TSMC. So he would say that they always work hand in hand with their customers. And oftentimes the customers would embed a team working with them because they need so much of this interaction and immediate feedback in order to improve design and manufacture the chips for their clients. So it sounds like it's similar, the dynamics and how they work.
Dynamics is very similar. Yeah, you cannot build a hardware ecosystem
Exactly.
in a vacuum. And that probably explains all these other questions that people are wondering about. Oh, why is the H200 not being let into China? The US has already granted licenses, but China hasn't allowed H22 actually come into the market. Is because my personal observation is that the more you have NVIDIA chips that are frankly not that good anymore, they are previous generation chips, they're very usable. That dilutes the effort of co-designing between your best labs in China and your leading GPU vendor being Huawei and other vendors that are already coming up in the scene as well. I will say, by and large, NVIDIA still has a stronghold in China right now, especially when it comes to training workload, the inference workload. Huawei is inching into that marketplace, but it's still limited in terms of in production. But again, if you see where the puck is going, right?
So would you agree when Jensen Huang says that he doesn't believe it's in American interest to lose the market to China? And probably he doesn't mean just selling chips, but more in the ecosystem, right? It sounds like that's what he implies. And that's why you're saying they really want to develop their own domestic capabilities by working more closely with their domestic models.
If the Blackwell chips, which is significantly better than the Hopper chips, somehow is on the negotiation table, I think the Chinese side will have a very different attitude towards whether to let that in or not. And of course, there will be a huge debate as opposed to whether we should sell any of Blackwells to China to begin with. The most important takeaway from this trip is that very closely knit co-design software hardware partnership between the leading labs in China and the leading hardware makers in China are running. That flywheel is happening. That improvement is happening literally on a daily basis. Like fixes are being delivered on a 24-hour turnarounds. So in a sense, if you think about it from Jensen's perspective, yeah, I think his market share is not only being reduced to zero, his current install base in China, which still is fairly large by legacy, is getting eroded as well. And of course, that's probably a cause for concern if you're in his seat.
Yeah. What about applications?
Among the 5-layer cakes, the applications that are being produced by the American labs are actually leading the Chinese counterparts. Because we interacted with the researchers, we talked a lot about coding. That's the big killer use case for leading AI models right now is AI coding getting better and better. All of them use Claude Code. So that's exhibit number one as to which size application is better. Claude Code is still blowing everybody out of the water, even in a market that supposedly is not allowed to use Claude Code. They think it's quite the gold standard for coding a product, so they're using it as their own benchmark. Now, on the consumer side, I have a less of a clearer sense of that because China has a pretty vibrant consumer tech ecosystem that is both very unique and very fast moving. We saw that in the blowing up of the OpenClaw adoption earlier this year, which is this AI agent harness that's also open source that really took the world by storm, but I believe probably more in China than anywhere else in the world. There's this like 100 claw battle going on in China right now where every lab has its own version of a claw from OpenClaw, and that's a purely consumer product for the most part, at least initially. Everyday people having their own AI agent to do stuff. ByteDance's Doubao product, which is their ChatGPT equivalent, or probably a bit more sophisticated even, is growing really well and has a lot more functionality built into it. They just started charging for a paid version as well, so we'll see how that commercialization goes. So the consumer side, it could be neck and neck. China might be in the lead a little bit. I don't really know. But from like an enterprise coding side, America is still quite ahead from a product perspective.
Even in the US, what you're seeing is Anthropic, because of Claude, seems to pull way ahead, which is consumer facing, right?
That's right. And OpenAI is trying to catch up as well with the Codex product, which is their Claude Code equivalent to eat away at this one killer use case right now. It's not a foregone conclusion, but Claude Code market share in China is 100%.
Okay, now what about energy? In my view, it's like hard to believe kind of information. They all say China has like very sufficient energy supply, and so computing is not an issue, unlike in the US. What is your view?
I think that's largely correct from my observation in the sense that energy never came up in any of our conversation. If we did a similar tour in the US of the leading labs and talked to researchers and what have
It's all
you,
about energy.
one of them is going to complain to us about energy, right? Whether it's permitting, whether it's the regulatory side or grid, that just isn't something that your everyday AI researcher in China wakes up worrying about.
Well, where do they get their energy? Like, do they have a lot of data centers?
Their data center constraint is not the energy that powers the building, which is what we have as a problem here in the US. Their problem is they can't fill that building with enough high-end chips and compute for them to do their best work. So they might have to settle with less powerful compute. Is it an actual problem? I don't know. But certainly from their perspective, it's not something that they think is limiting their ability to do their job, right? In the ways that I think is much more palpable here in the United States.
I wonder if it has anything to do with the government's role. Like, the government makes sure that energy supply will not be an issue at the minimum in China.
Right. I think that's one of those kind of basic assumptions that you check off if you operate really anything in China. Like if we take it beyond the labs, right? We go into manufacturing, just building a random factory that makes some stuff, right? I don't think any of those factory or building makers are worried about the fact that when they build a building, there's no power coming into the building. Like that will be powered somehow from whoever you deal with from your power supply. I know for a fact that a lot of these builders who are now building in Mexico, for example, or like your China plus one countries are having trouble. It's like if you build a building in Mexico, you may not have the power, and they find it quite preposterous that is something they have to worry about, but that's something we do worry about in the United States.
I want to move on to talk about open source because I know you've been one of the earlier champions for open source, and now we're seeing why it matters so much. Tell us how this open source model is going to differentiate Chinese AI startups.
One is that open sourcing or open weighting your model and your research has become widely recognized among the Chinese labs as a very important, if not crucial, strategy to increase their overseas exposure and market potential. And the reason is twofold. One is that I think we can all admit that there's a bit of a geopolitical toxicity to the China brand on everything and anything. And you can't get around that as a lab. But what you can do is show your work. You show your code, you show your weight, you let the market and the developer community kick the tire with no barrier or no friction to entry. And then you can kind of let your tech speak for itself. That gives you a chance to really earn the trust or the users or the customers over time. That's why you see this huge group of open models from China from last year and continuing. The second part of the answer is that there is a very strong desire, particularly among the researchers who are engineers, who all learned from open source code programming as they grew up in their own technical education, a lot of those came from the West, right? Whether it's Linux back in the days, or all the open source databases, or all the hacker culture, that's all kind of like your quintessential Western technical lore, right? A lot of that has deep roots in open source. So they personally love open source in a way that is quite idealistic. And I think they want to prove to the world that they can also build really good technology. And the only way you can really prove the world is to open source it as well, right? They do have this notion or sense of giving back after having taken so much from open source that I think is very much underrated or underappreciated from observers, from most people out here in the West.
It's almost like a philosophical stance.
Open source is I will call it a quasi-religion. For sure. People who are very passionate about open source are quite religious about a lot of the principles that undergird open source, and they fight about it all the time. Even the open models, a lot of people don't think it's really open source because it's not completely open. You just open with the model, but you didn't open with your data set. A lot of Chinese engineers, especially these younger folks, are very passionate about giving back to open source as a way to both maybe prove themselves to the world, but also to give back to the world.
Now, let's say China pretty much has adopted open source. Is that still a debate in the US, in Silicon Valley?
I think it's a debate actually in both countries. There is now a split in opinion inside the Chinese ecosystem
Really?
about open versus closed. These are never static situations. They're always moving as the market moves. The threshold that I've observed from these labs in China is the 1 trillion parameter model size. Some labs thinks open sourcing 1 trillion parameter or bigger is actually a waste of resources, and they would rather host it on their cloud platform to serve it up as a set of APIs, just like Claude and OpenAI, and charge for it because the model is too big to be used on a laptop or a phone or a robot or locally on any machine anyways, which is a big main use case of open sourcing anything, is that you can download it and try it for yourself before you do something more with it, right? You cannot download a 1 trillion parameter model on your laptop, but you have another set of opinion in China that I think is still the majority right now, that open sourcing is a path to technical innovation, potentially even to AGI. If you're a lab and you can't even build a model that is 1 trillion parameters or bigger and have it be somewhat intelligent, then you're probably out of the game for the next phase.
So it sounds like China started as open source, and now because it's more advanced and has more data set, so more people now advocating for closed source.
There's a growing voice. It's an open debate within the ecosystem. The way I interpret it is that there is a stronger commercial pressure for a lot of these labs to generate revenue. So closing your best model is the most direct way, if not the most short-term way, to get at that money. That's a very palpable pressure weighed on the entire AI landscape globally, not just in China. And then two, one of the biggest labs in China that funnily we don't really talk about as much, but actually on the ground people are most concerned about competitively, is ByteDance, their seed model team. And they've been closed source from the very beginning. So they've always bucked the trend, and they're doing really well.
Yeah.
And they're putting out very good product in addition to really good models, but they've never open sourced. So this sort of typecasting that every lab in China has to open source because the government likes open source, therefore they mandate everybody to open source, is kind of complete bogus.
Sounds like the bigger, the more profitability that you have, you would likely want to lean towards closing the source.
For some labs, you know what, we don't care. All the open source models that are 1 trillion parameters or larger are all coming from China right now. DeepSeek's newest model, V4, is like 1.65 trillion. The Kimi model is definitely more than 1 trillion. The Mimo model, which is from the Xiaomi team, is more than 1 trillion. There might be a couple more that I'm blanking on right now.
What does that mean? Do you think they'll increasingly start to close?
I don't know, right? I think that's what's interesting to watch, but I think assuming that all Chinese models will continue to open source in perpetuity, as a way to flood the market, or you can put in your favorite overcapacity analogy to the industry, just doesn't work.
There's so much anxiety in American society when it comes to like AI, its impact on the future work and education. How does China feel about AI?
You know the nuances of the country better than most people, Wenchi. It really depends on who you talk to. We talk to mostly to the AI researchers who are probably AGI pilled from birth, right? We ask them, what does AGI mean to you? These 26, 27-year-old researchers. And two of them from two different labs, completely, I don't think they know each other, told us the same answer, which is that, oh, I think AGI just means AI can one day do my job, which would be so cool and so awesome. And there's like no anxiety in their eyes, at least, of losing their job to AI. They're just like, if I can build something that can do all these things that I do, how cool would that be? And I'll just move on to do something else, right? Maybe just youth idealism. So from that particular researcher crowd, I don't think the anxiety is quite there. That being said, if you, again, coming back to the open claw craze in China a few months ago, you see grannies, grandpas, uncles on the street getting hands-on help from Tencent researchers in Shenzhen to install their claw.
Really? Wow.
Yeah,
Oh,
there are like pictures of like people lining up outside the Tencent and the Baidu headquarters. They set up like booth and stuff to like get hands-on installation of OpenClaw. My read on that is a different reaction to the same anxiety, which is
well,
that
say more about that. I mean, I find that fascinating that you would have companies who are helping the elderly, which you don't see here in the US or we haven't heard about.
that's right. I would say, yeah, there are two ways to think about it, right? One is a pure consumer habit. I think in China, but just a country with a different set of culture, it's actually very normal to buy hands-on IT service to help you fix something, right? Like if you're in China, you're an older person, you go on Taobao, you find like a smart young person to help you fix your computer, and you pay them 100 RMB.
Or like my mom, she just does it. She just always asks anyone who can do it for free.
It's like a more savvier consumer, right? That's not weird to get a younger person to help an older person to do
Yeah,
things.
right.
Right. So that's number one. And number two, because of that, Tencent and Baidu and others are rolling out these services to get more adoption onto their version of Claw, to grow users in a way that is very hands-on, very friendly, but also very open to the masses in a way that I think there's always a bit of an elitism to tech adoption here in the US. It's very much, oh, it's the young, cool SF crowd that does it. It's not for your senior homes here in Nashville where I live. So that's kind of problem number one. But coming back to the overall kind of anxiety question, I think Chinese people are just as anxious about a lot of things in the future. It's a pretty anxious population. If you like the hustle with the 996, that's all, in my opinion, like a reaction to the future's uncertain. Let's work our ass off right now. And I think embracing technology is a part of addressing that, right? You'd never want to fall behind, even as an 80-year-old grandma who read about this on her WeChat friend group, and now she's in front of Tencent's headquarters trying to figure this out.
So in some way, there's so many sources of anxiety in China right now. This is probably one of them. They don't see it as the cause to their future problems. Instead, the adoption of technology or technology related skills is probably one of their ways to overcome the anxiety about the future rather than the source. You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
I do. And my interpretation is that everybody in China is staring down a demographic abyss. Population is aging, the birth rate is not keeping up. That's been happening for a long time. And it was just like a slow moving train that no one can really biologically reverse very easily. Embracing technology, whether it's robotics, humanoids, or more automation from your AI model software to keep up with the times, right? There's a new thing now called OPC, one person company in China. That's a very hot new thing that a lot of governments are adopting. OPC and OpenClaw went hand in hand together. So there's like this confluence of things going on that also made OpenClaw a lot more popular in China.
So are you saying the government is encouraging one person company, basically?
Oh yeah, these are I don't know about the central government per se, but definitely a lot of local governments in regions that you would assume are a bit more entrepreneurial and commercial minded have official supports of OPC. That is to probably just combat this anxiety. We are seeing similar layoffs or potential layoffs that are AI induced in China. We're also seeing the courts in China intervening to slow down at least that pace in a way to protect the everyday people from being axed by AI in ways that we haven't actually seen a similar response, I think, in the United States yet. I just think the way that the Chinese people respond to these anxieties are different than your typical Americans, which is that we have avenues to picket and protest. We have city councils to show up to and complain and stop certain things. There is no such thing in China. So what do? You line up in front of the Tencent office to keep up.
Yeah, they would just work around it.
They work hard around it, right?
Yes.
They work around it and they work extra
Yeah,
to make up for
exactly.
it, right?
Very Chinese spirit. What about the investor sentiment? I remember last year I read quite some media coverage saying how Chinese models are not making money, and so they don't really know what's the point of having so many AI startups or within the bigger companies. What about now? A lot of them are being funded, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones that we hear about in the AI lab cohort, the ones that we met on the trip, they've survived the first wave of the bloodbath. If you remember 2 years ago, there was like the 100 model war. Now we have maybe like 20 model give and take that are doing well. So we sort of know the winner, quote unquote, from the first batch of calling. So it's probably a little bit safer now as an investor to invest in Kimi than it was 2 years ago. That's number one. Two, we talked to a few robotics founders as well. That's in a totally different world than everything that we've talked about so far. And there's quite a bit of a bubble. These are words from the founders themselves, not me, who feels like the robotics scene in China is way too frothy. There are literally hundreds of robotic startups in China getting funded by, of course, local investment firms. All of them do something in the whole robotic supply chain. A lot of them are not differentiated. A lot of them are probably going to die 2 years from now. But that is where all the money is getting piled into from an investment perspective as it relates to AI.
Is it the right understanding to say, in terms of AI models itself, let's say if it's called an industry or a sector, it's safer now because the battle was already in the past, whereas the robotics battle is happening right now, maybe like AI models 2 years ago. Like every sector in China, basically, you start with like everyone is involved until whoever can survive.
That's right. Yeah, I think that pattern is quite consistent, right, over many industries. We're just seeing the model makers and the robotics world at different stages of that cycle. The model makers a little bit later on. I think they're probably in the middle is how I would think about it. They're still very fiercely competitive. I still don't think all the current model makers can or will survive in the long term. It's still very hard to differentiate, but it's a lesser number of competitors. While the robotic side feels like what the model world was 2 years ago, if not even frothier. You can think as a way that China expresses its own unique advantage as it comes to manufacturing, as it comes to supply chain, in ways that are actually quite differentiated. There's nothing that differentiates China's ecosystem, in my opinion, when it comes to making large language models. But there is a huge differentiation between China and the rest of the world when it comes to making sophisticated hardware products.
Now, another source of anxiety in the US is cyber and security in general. Do you feel that in China?
Not from the trip, but I think that's probably because of the people that we talk to. I think if you talk to people who are more on the cybersecurity side of things, Mythos being previewed while we're there was palpable, I think, in a lot of people's mind. But it wasn't something that we discussed a whole lot, if only because there's not a whole lot to discuss because no one really knows that much about it to begin with, right? It's just this thing that's like kind of hanging that we all know about by being in the AI ecosystem.
But there's nothing equivalent developed by Chinese.
No, I don't think there's anything even close at this point to being developed by any Chinese lab.
want to come back to US-China dynamics because the fear of not having any safety guardrails propelled the two governments to start a dialogue 2 years ago during the Biden administration and then kind of stop. And then now sounds like both governments just announced a renewed AI dialogue after the Trump-Xi summit. What do you know about it? What are they going to talk about, or what's really going to come out of it?
That was the one thing that really perked my ears from the Trump-Xi summit is the dialogue to dialogue is what I like to call it. We don't really know what the dialogue is about yet. We know they're going to dialogue about having a dialogue. Which is a good development. I do think it's mythos triggered for sure from the United States side. We brought it as an agenda item to China that we wanted to establish this dialogue, but also we wanted to establish it from a position of strength, which mythos gave us from the United States perspective. So far, it looks like the Chinese side is also willing to entertain this dialogue. From the outside, it looks like it's to prevent non-state actors or terrorist groups essentially from accessing advanced models in a way that feels very much like a nuclear non-proliferation-ish type dynamic. Based on what I've seen so far, the division or the team from the Chinese side, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is being tagged so far to be the point team, is part of the non-proliferation team. From our side, it's run by the Treasury Department.
Although there seems to be some infighting as well, right? Like whether it should be run by White
So we don't
House.
even know who from our side is going to run point on this dialogue to dialogue. I would call it the myth around the mythos is what led to this moment. 2 years ago, when the Biden administration and the Chinese counterpart had this idea of having an AI dialogue, it was one much more limited because the whole evolution of this new age of AI was very nascent. And I would say at the time, whatever was agreed on was also nuclear weapon related, which is that both countries agreed that neither country would allow AI to launch nuclear weapon, and there will always be a human in the loop, which seems like a very common sense idea to agree on, and I'm glad the two countries agreed on it. So we're at this very basic level of what should we not let the AI do to preserve humanity level of dialogue, while the technology is running quite rapidly in ways that are very hard to predict and also settle on when you talk.
It feels a little bit out of control. And so both governments kind of need to sit down and make sure this is still at least in human hands, right? It's also fascinating to watch, because of AI, how the two superpowers interact with each other. So you have this out of fear kind of collaboration, and then everything else is framed as competition. Let's talk a little bit about that, because fundamentally that's how the rhetoric and the media plays out in terms of both countries and AI. Let's start with Meta and Manus. What did you hear on the ground?
The Meta and Manus deal explosion literally happened on the first day of our trip in China. After we left the Kimi office, we read it on Twitter or whatever in the bus. But I think the Kimi moonshot team actually is one of the first collateral damage of this deal explosion.
How?
In the sense that this is publicly reported now, so nothing that's proprietary information, that they had plans to raise money from overseas investors from Silicon Valley because of their traction, because of their growth. They're doing really, really well. They have very good reputation in Silicon Valley. We have leading AI companies like Cursor, for example, another really hot growing AI coding agent platform, using Kimi's model as a base model to train their own model. So we come back to this, I call it a coopetition framework, where we are actually co-opting each other's product and research and results quite effectively to improve each other underneath this whole competition narrative. Kimi and Cursor is like exhibit number one that I like to tell people about. But I think because of the whole Manus Meta deal falling apart, I don't think that is on the table anymore for moonshots. They'll figure out some other way. They're going to go public in Hong Kong. They're probably still going to do fine. That was something that literally has shifted the ground a little bit while we're in China because of this news.
More recently, travel bans of top AI talent from China to overseas trips, and then also investment curb in American tech companies into Chinese AI companies. It is ironic to watch this because this was what the US has been doing or started doing a couple years ago, and now China is doing all that. What is that telling us?
There is a hoarding effect of very high-end technical talent that is happening in China, actually what's happening in South Korea as well when it comes to memory. Executives
Yeah.
leaving SK to go to China or Singapore to do consulting, and they actually like face trials of treason a couple of years ago. So different countries are having a very
Taiwan
different
too.
response.
Taiwan actually is one of the
Taiwan,
first in the world to start imposing this kind of restrictions. Yeah, but
that's right. And the judicial system is very much a part of the enforcement of that. So it's certainly very scary if you are one of them. It's impeding the movement of people freely. But from a national interest perspective, they consider these talent the national property, right? You can call it treasure in a good way, but it's really property in another way. And I think the Manus outflow, the Manus journey showed how this could be a problem of talent outflow from the Chinese government that I think is undesirable. And the easiest way to do that is just prevent people from leaving, right? Is it the nicest way? Certainly not.
yeah, what does that mean in terms of talent? If you look at the past, the most talented Chinese STEM students come to the US top universities to get a degree, and then maybe they stay here, work in top firms, and then they go back to work for big companies or they start their own companies. This is telling us a different story or a different future now.
There are a lot of different layers of irony to this, right? One is what you said, the Chinese government is actually doing the job of that the US government wants to do. Two, these PhD interns that I'm obsessing over, a lot of them, if not all of them, are from domestic universities who's never studied abroad and went through the Chinese education system that has become very talented people that are now working in some of these labs. This should be a point of pride for China, but I don't know if this kind of policy actually chills these folks in the future. They actually want to stay in China because the opportunity is good. Yeah, it may not pay as much as if they get a job from Google or Meta, let alone the visa problem that they have to deal with. But they have a good lifestyle. They know people, they enjoy the people they work with, they like their environment, they like the work that they do. They're still all building AGI and very passionate about it. But of course, maybe they like to be able to travel freely abroad for conferences, to visit other companies, to exchange. How does these policies chill those folks as they look into the future? It could be a shoot yourself in the foot kind of moment.
We all know if you're top talent, you want to work for top firms. So in the past, top firms are always in the US. But if these days, especially in AI, that's why I think DeepSeek was so shocking to the world. None of the researchers actually study abroad. They're all like homegrown PhD students. If that's going to be the trend in the future, but what does that mean in terms of collaboration? In the past, you would see Silicon Valley really wants to collaborate with best university, best talent, best companies in the world. But in the past 10 years, it's become really hard for US and China to really collaborate on top level science and technology, not to mention AI. What does that mean for US China AI? Collaboration, competition? And you have a term, coopetition?
Right. I mean, that's the term that I like to use as opposed to race, right? Or competition. I don't think there is a race in the sense that there's no finish line, there's no endpoint. We don't know who will win the race because we don't even know where the finish line is. So it's a very stupid analogy. Two, I think the competition will always be here, and I think a healthy competition is very good. I think both sides will probably want some kind of healthy competition to egg each other on. There's nothing wrong with that. I do think there's a lot of co-opting each other's work, right? I mentioned the Cursor and Kimi being one of them. There's a lot of others out there that I can share, right? But I think there's a healthy respect if you're just in the industry and you're not too caught up in the myopia of policy discussion. As far as like a big capital C cooperation, I don't think there will be too many of those. The AI safety / dialogue thing, I wouldn't even call that a cooperation per se. It's more of a let's not blow each other apart doomsday hotline. That's great that we are doing that even. There's not even any certainty that we were going to do that to begin with, which is very terrifying. So coopetition is the way I like to both describe what I think is actually happening on the ground today and what I think is satisfactory going forward as far as the state of play.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's always so fascinating to hear you analyze, diagnose, and help us understand what's going on. According to Kevin Xu, US labs are still ahead on serious production grade applications, while China is moving extremely fast and experimenting aggressively in consumer facing AI. Operating under constraints around talent mobility, limited access to high end compute, an immature domestic hardware software stack, geopolitical headwinds, and a less trusted China brand, plus mounting pressure to turn a profit. These same forces are simultaneously barriers and drivers of China's AI progress. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.